Good evening, and welcome to the Sleep to Law series. Tonight we explore the haunting, desolate world left behind after the devastating superflu pandemic known as Captain Trips. As we prepare to step into this quiet apocalypse, take a slow, deep breath. Let the tension leave your shoulders, and if you like, subscribe and leave a comment below, telling me your local time or where you are listening from tonight. In King's epic novel, first published in 1978 and later expanded as the complete and uncut edition in 1990, a biological weapon called Project Blue escapes a military lab in the California desert. With a 99.4% mortality rate, this constantly shifting antigen virus brings humanity to the brink of extinction in less than a month. What remains is an eerie, silent landscape scattered with stalled cars and decaying cities. We follow the 0.6% who miraculously survived, ordinary people like Stu Redman, Franny Goldsmith, and Larry Underwood. In this post-apocalyptic aftermath, these survivors are caught in a cosmic tug-of-war, drawn by psychic dreams to either the benevolent 108-year-old Mother Abigail in Hemingford Home, Nebraska, or the demonic Randall Flagg gathering dark forces in Las Vegas. It is a story of survival, and of the war between two futures for whoever is left standing. The stand didn't arrive in a vacuum either. King has cited George R. Stewart's 1949 novel Earth Abides, about survivors of a different plague that wipes out most of humanity, as a pivotal inspiration, part of a post-apocalyptic lineage running through King's superflu into most pandemic fiction that followed. Chapter 1. The Silence and the Sorting. The end of the world did not arrive with a flash of light or a rain of fire. It started with a sneeze. Deep in the California desert, a military installation known as Project Blue ran a series of classified biological tests. The government had funded the creation of a weaponized virus, a microscopic killer designed to be unstoppable. King didn't invent this premise from nothing. In 1968, a nerve agent test at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah drifted off range and killed thousands of sheep in the surrounding valleys. The Army's chemical weapons testing was publicly blamed for the deaths, and the incident contributed to a formal U.S. policy shift on chemical and biological defense. That real government cover-up is the template Project Blue's handlers follow the moment Campion gets loose. The scientists called it a shifting-antigen flu. In simple terms, when a normal virus enters a host, the human immune system works to build antibodies to fight it off. But this engineered virus was different. The moment the human body created an antibody, the virus mutated. It shifted its form, making the new antibody useless. The body would try again, and the virus would shift again. It was a tireless, evolving invader that kept changing its locks every time the immune system forged a new key. The fail-safes at Project Blue were supposed to be foolproof. If a breach occurred, the computers would lock down the facility in a matter of seconds, trapping everyone inside behind thick steel doors. But machines are only as perfect as the people who build them, and people make mistakes. A microsecond lag in the security system gave a security guard named Charles Campion just enough time to see the warning lights turn red. This microsecond lag was no mere mechanical glitch. It was the subtle, guiding hand of the Crimson King, the ultimate force of chaos, ensuring the virus escaped. The superflu, or Captain Trips, was the instrument used to turn this version of Earth into a devastated tomb world, an alternate level of the Dark Tower where the protective beams of reality had begun to fracture. Panic took over. Campion grabbed his wife and baby daughter, jumped into his car, and drove away from the base before the gates sealed shut. He thought he was saving his family. He did not know he was already carrying the plague in his lungs. Notice what actually starts the apocalypse here. It isn't malice. Campion isn't a saboteur or a fanatic. He's a scared father doing the most human thing imaginable, protecting his family at the exact moment that instinct becomes the most dangerous act in history. That's a shape King returns to again and again over the next 1,000 pages. Ordinary impulses, love, fear, jealousy, ambition, doing more damage than any villain manages alone. Campion drove east. He pushed his old Chevrolet across the state lines, feeling a little tired, a little feverish. By the time he reached the small town of Arnett, Texas, the sickness had ravaged his body. His neck swelled and turned dark, the trademark symptom of the disease that would soon be known as Captain Trips. His wife and daughter died in the car. Campion himself lived just long enough to crash into the gas pumps at Bill Hapscom's Texaco station, where a group of local men pulled him from the wreckage. Campion coughed, spraying the men with infected saliva. The chain reaction began. The men at the gas station went home. They kissed their wives, hugged their children, and went to the local diner. They sneezed. They coughed. They handed money to cashiers. The virus spread with terrifying speed. It possessed a 99.4% communicability rate and a 100% lethality rate. If you caught it, you died. And almost everyone caught it. The military tried to contain the fallout. They locked down towns, strung barbed wire across highways, and sent out teams in white isolation suits. But you cannot shoot a virus, and you cannot quarantine the wind. Soldiers caught the flu and passed it to their commanders. The government tried to lie to the public, taking over television stations and broadcasting soothing messages about a mild outbreak of Russian flu. They promised a vaccine. There was no vaccine. When reporters tried to tell the truth, soldiers silenced them. In some cities, desperate citizens took over broadcast booths, showing live footage of dump trucks pushing bodies into the ocean, only to be executed on the air. This section became a real touchstone when COVID hit in 2020, to the point King himself had to publicly say the coronavirus wasn't actually like his fictional superflu. Then, the noise stopped. The television screens dissolved into static. The radio stations buzzed with white noise. The hum of traffic faded away. The great machinery of American civilization ground to a halt. The air filled with the sweet, sickening smell of decay. In less than a month, the world belonged to the 0.6% of the population who just happened to be immune. Stuart Redman was one of those immune few. Stu was a quiet, observant factory worker from Arnett. He was at the Texaco station when Campion crashed. When the military swept into Arnett, they packed Stu and his friends into ambulances and flew them to a plague center in Atlanta and later to a specialized facility in Stovington, Vermont. The doctors isolated Stu in a sterile room, drawing his blood day after day. They watched from behind thick glass as the men from Arnett succumbed to the sickness. Stu watched his friends die, their faces turning dark, their chests rattling as they drowned in their own fluids. Stu felt fine. He never developed a cough. He never ran a fever. The doctors in Atlanta, men named Denninger and Dietz, grew desperate. They injected Stu with the virus, hoping to see how his body fought it off. Stu killed the virus, but the doctors could not figure out how or why. Medically, it was an anomaly, but cosmically, Stu was being shielded by the concept of Ka, the force of destiny that binds the universe. The forces of the White, the cosmic counterbalance to the Crimson King's madness, had marked this quiet Texan for survival, ensuring his path remained open because he would soon be needed to lead a new quartet against the coming darkness. That anomaly was about to become dangerous. As the world outside the hospital walls collapsed, Stu realized his immunity made him a liability. The government wanted to keep the virus a secret, and Stu knew too much. As the days passed, the rigid order of the Stovington facility began to crumble. The nurses stopped coming. The armed guards in the hallways grew sick and vanished. The intercoms went silent. The plague had breached the sterile walls. One night, the thick door to Stu's room hummed open. A man named Elder stepped inside. Elder carried a pistol wrapped in a plastic bag, his manner flat and businesslike. He did not come to run tests. He came to tie up loose ends. The military was executing the immune survivors to ensure no one lived to tell the story of Project Blue. Stu had spent his life keeping his head down and avoiding trouble, but he refused to die quietly in a hospital bed. When Elder pointed the gun, Stu shouted that there was a rat right behind him. And in the split second Elder's attention broke, Stu swung a heavy metal chair into his arm. The revolver flew from his hand and discharged as it hit the floor, and Elder went down for good. Stu stood over the body, breathing fast. He picked up the dropped pistol and stepped out of his quarantine room. The corridors of Stovington were a nightmare. The bright fluorescent lights flickered, casting long shadows over the tile floors. Bodies littered the hallways. Doctors in lab coats and soldiers in uniform lay sprawled near the elevators. Some of them had shot themselves to escape the agonizing final stages of the flu. Stu walked past rooms filled with advanced medical equipment, all of it useless now, and past a young man slumped dead over a desk in one of the lab carrels. Stu kept moving. He found the emergency exit and pushed the door open. He stepped out into the cool, dark Vermont night. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. There were no sirens. There were no cars on the distant highway. There was only the wind. Stu Redman, a man from the flat, dusty plains of East Texas, stood alone in the mountains, a free man in a graveyard world. Sit with that phrase for a second. Stu spent his whole life as a quiet, watched, unremarkable man, and the plague hands him total freedom at the exact moment it removes everything that freedom was supposed to be for. That paradox, survival arriving indistinguishable from loss, is the emotional register the first half of the book lives in, long before anyone's heard the name Randall Flagg. Miles away, the island of Manhattan was a concrete tomb. Larry Underwood sat on a park bench in Central Park, staring at the stagnant water of the duck pond. Larry was a musician who had just hit the big time. His song, "Baby, Can You Dig Your Man?" was climbing the charts when the flu hit. He had returned to New York to visit his mother, Alice, bringing a pocket full of advance money and a head full of dreams. But the virus did not care about record sales. Larry watched his mother die on the floor of her apartment, her skin burning with fever, her mind lost in delirium. When she took her last breath, Larry fled out into the streets. New York City had descended into madness. Looters smashed store windows. Fires burned unchecked in the Bronx and Brooklyn. The subways stalled in the tunnels, trapping thousands in the dark. Then the sickness took the looters, and the fires burned themselves out. Larry wandered the empty avenues, avoiding the bloated bodies piled on the sidewalks. He felt a gnawing guilt. He had always been a taker, a man who ran away when things got difficult. His mother had told him as much before she died. Now there was no one left to take from, and nowhere left to run. Hold on to that self-verdict. A taker, a man who runs. Larry doesn't argue with it here, and for a long stretch neither does the book. Staying with Rita out of obligation, recoiling from Nadine, eventually walking calmly into a cage outside Las Vegas. Almost everything he does afterward can be read as a slow, unannounced argument with his mother's judgment of him. King never says outright that Larry is trying to prove her wrong. He just keeps giving him chances to. He met a woman named Rita Blakemore in the park. Rita was wealthy, older, and struggling to cope with the sudden end of her privileged life. She carried a purse stuffed with diamond rings and prescription pills. Larry and Rita clung to each other out of sheer necessity, forming a fragile bond in the ruins of the city. They needed to leave Manhattan. The stench of decay was growing stronger every day. With the bridges blocked by military barricades and stalled vehicles, Larry made a grim decision. They would walk out of the city through the Lincoln Tunnel. The entrance to the tunnel was a chaotic jumble of abandoned cars and military transport trucks. Larry and Rita squeezed past the metal bumpers and stepped into the tiled throat of the tunnel. The emergency lights were dead. The darkness inside was thick and suffocating. Larry clicked on a plastic butane lighter. The small, wavering flame illuminated a horrific scene. The traffic lanes were crammed with cars, sitting bumper to bumper all the way into the gloom. The drivers and passengers were still inside, trapped in their vehicles when the gridlock took hold and the virus took their lives. Rita's nerve broke first, and she pushed ahead onto the elevated pedestrian catwalk, vanishing into the dark, while Larry fumbled with the lighter behind her. He walked in silence until a desperate scream echoed in the darkness ahead. It was Rita Blakemore, terrified and waiting. The air was stale, laced with the smell of spilled gasoline and spoiled flesh. Larry's thumb grew numb on the lighter. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the beam of light revealed a soldier sitting on the catwalk. His legs splayed across the path. A switchblade jutted from his throat. Larry felt the hair rise on his arms. He stepped over the dead man carefully, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Larry?" Rita whispered, her voice bouncing off the tiled walls. "Are you there?" "Right here," Larry replied, trying to keep his voice steady. A few yards later, Larry's foot caught on something soft. The lighter slipped from his sweaty fingers. It hit the catwalk, bounced over the railing, and clattered into the dark traffic lanes below. Blackness swallowed them. Larry froze. His mind began to play tricks on him. He heard the subtle shift of fabric. He imagined the doors of the stalled cars clicking open. He pictured the dead reaching out from the dark, their cold fingers grasping for his ankles. In this suffocating blackness, Larry was brushing against the edges of Todash space, the infinite, maddening void that exists between the levels of the Dark Tower. Catastrophic events can thin the fabric of reality, turning spaces like the Lincoln Tunnel into thinnies, where the living mind is exposed to the cosmic horrors of the outer dark, magnifying human guilt and terror to a breaking point. He forced himself to drop to his knees, patting the concrete, searching for the lighter. His hands brushed against damp fabric, a cold shoe, a stiffened arm. The catwalk was littered with bodies, people who had abandoned their cars and tried to run, only to be gunned down by the panicked military guards stationed at the exits. Rita began to sob, the sound escalating into a hysterical wail. The echoes amplified her cries, making it sound as if a dozen women were screaming in the dark. "Stay still!" Larry shouted, his voice cracking. He crawled forward, climbing over the tangle of limbs and torsos. The smell was overpowering. He felt the cold touch of a dead face against his palm. He pushed the revulsion down, forcing himself to keep moving. He found Rita in the dark, grabbed her hand, and pulled her forward. They stumbled over the remaining bodies, guided only by the faint grey arch of daylight appearing at the far end of the tunnel. When they finally staggered out into the New Jersey sunlight, they fell to the pavement, gasping for fresh air. Larry looked back at the black maw of the tunnel. He had survived the crossing, but the experience had stripped away the last of his illusions. The old world was gone, replaced by a ruthless landscape that demanded a new kind of strength. It's worth noticing the technique King is using here. Nearly every other set piece in this book gives you something to look at. A swollen neck, a body in a ditch, a pair of red eyes in the dark. The tunnel gives you nothing. Larry can't see what he's crawling over, and neither can we. The horror is built entirely out of touch and sound, which means your own imagination is doing King's work for him. It's also the first time in the story Larry is responsible for someone besides himself. Not running, but pulling Rita forward through the dark. Small detail, but it's the first crack in the taker identity he confessed to a few scenes back. Far away, in the small town of Shoyo, Arkansas, another survivor faced a different kind of trial. Nick Andros was 22 years old, a drifter who had lost his parents at a young age. He was also deaf and mute. Nick navigated the world through keen observation, reading lips and writing notes on a small pad he carried in his shirt pocket. Nick was passing through Shoyo when a group of local men looking for trouble, led by a man named Ray Booth, cornered him on a dark road and beat him brutally, leaving him bleeding in the dirt. The town sheriff, John Baker, found Nick and took him in. Baker was a fair man. He locked up the men who attacked Nick and, recognizing Nick's intelligence and resilience, made him a temporary deputy. But Captain Trips arrived in Shoyo shortly after. Sheriff Baker grew sick, his breathing turning into a wet rattle. He died in his bed, leaving Nick alone to watch over the prisoners. The men in the cells begged to be released as the virus took hold of the town. Nick fed them and eventually tossed the keys to Mike Childress, allowing him to escape. He watched as the others succumbed to the sickness, their necks swelling, their lungs filling with fluid, all except Ray Booth, who had evaded capture and slipped back into town to attack Nick a second time. Nick shot him dead in the struggle, though not before it cost him the sight in one eye, which he'd cover with a patch for the rest of his journey. It's Nick's only act of violence in the entire book, and what provokes it is worth sitting with. Not the plague itself, but a second, unprovoked attack from a man who's only free to hurt him because the ordinary machinery of consequence, police, courts, a functioning town, no longer exists. That's the pattern running under this whole opening act. King isn't asking who's good and who's evil yet. He's asking what a person does in the gap between the old rules disappearing and the new ones not existing yet. And Nick, the character with the least literal voice in the book, is the first to answer with his fists. When the town was finally empty, Nick packed a bag, found a bicycle, and rode out of Shoyo. He pedaled through a landscape of silent farms and empty gas stations. He crossed into Oklahoma, the vast plains stretching out under a relentless sun. In the town of May, Oklahoma, Nick found someone else. He was riding down the main street when he saw a man sitting on the curb. The man was playing with a fleet of toy cars, running them around a plastic garage. He made engine noises with his lips, completely absorbed in his play. Nick stopped his bike and tapped the man on the shoulder. The man jumped, a look of guilty surprise flashing across his face. He had blonde hair and bright, expressive blue eyes. "I know it's for little boys," the man said defensively. "My daddy told me." Nick pulled out his pad and wrote a quick note, explaining that he was deaf and could not speak. He handed the pad over. The man stared at the paper, his brow furrowing. He handed it back. "I'm Tom Cullen," he said, "but I can't read. I only got to 3rd grade, but then I was 16, and my daddy made me quit. He said I was too big." Nick stared at him. He was a man who could not speak, standing in front of a man who could not read. The irony was almost too neat to be an accident. It's a pairing. King leans on more than once across his work. A character locked out of one kind of perception turning out to have privileged access to another. Danny Torrance's shine, Duddits in Dreamcatcher. And here, Nick's watchfulness paired with Tom's hidden clarity. The disability isn't incidental to the gift. In King's cosmology, it's very often the reason the gift gets through at all. It's the same quality that keeps both men off Flag's radar later on. But Nick saw the genuine kindness in Tom's eyes. Tom was developmentally disabled, operating with the innocence and logic of a young child, but he was alive and he was friendly. Yet Tom's simple mind masked a profound psychic sensitivity. This latent telepathic ability, which Mother Abigail confirms, exists in varying degrees among many of the survivors, allowed Tom to perceive truths others could not. In the long run, this unique psychic frequency would ultimately shield his mind from the probing demonic vision of the dark man. Nick used gestures to communicate. He pointed to himself, then to the bike, then down the road. He waved goodbye. Tom's face fell. Tears welled in his eyes. "You moving on? I don't want you to. I like you." Nick smiled. He pointed to Tom, then to the road. Tom's face lit up with a brilliant, wide smile. "Want me to go with you?" "Tom Cullen is going." Nick found a second bicycle, and the two men set off together. They developed a unique language of hand signals and expressions. Nick became the navigator and protector, while Tom provided a constant stream of cheerful, rambling dialogue. Tom talked about the cars he had seen, the food he liked, and his father, who had run off years ago. Nick listened, glad for the company, glad for the sound of a human voice, even if he could only perceive it through the movement of Tom's lips. They rode north, crossing into Kansas. The weather, which had been bright and hot, began to change. They were biking along a flat stretch of highway near the town of Roston when the wind died completely. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing against their skin like a wet blanket. Nick felt a strange, tingling pressure in his ears. He looked up. The sky in the west had turned a bruised, unnatural shade of purple. The clouds were boiling, twisting into strange shapes. Tom grabbed Nick's arm, his eyes wide with panic. "Tornado!" he yelled. "Tornado coming! Laws, yes!" Nick looked toward the horizon. A massive black funnel was dropping from the clouds. It was wider at the top, tapering down to a shifting dancing point that touched the earth. Where the funnel met the ground, Nick saw buildings explode into splinters. The tornado was tearing across the plains, ripping up grass, trees, and telephone poles, throwing them into the sky like matchsticks. Tom dropped his bike and ran toward a barn with an attached silo set back from the road. Nick followed, his legs pumping hard. He could not hear the roar of the wind, but he felt the ground trembling beneath his feet. They reached the barn. Tom pulled Nick toward a heavy wooden door. He yanked it open, revealing a set of dark wooden stairs leading down into a storm cellar. They scrambled down the stairs just as the sky above them turned pitch black. Tom slammed the door shut, plunging them into total darkness. The root cellar smelled of damp earth and rotting vegetables. Nick reached out, his hands brushing against wooden shelves lined with glass jars. The vibration in the ground grew stronger. The floorboards above them shook. Nick felt a sudden, sharp pressure drop in his chest, as if the air was being sucked from his lungs. He knew the tornado was passing directly over them. Tom grabbed Nick, pulling him into a tight embrace. Tom was trembling violently. Nick held onto the bigger man, burying his face against Tom's shoulder. In the suffocating dark, Nick's other senses heightened. He smelled the dirt, he felt the shaking wood. And then he felt something else. It was a presence. Nick opened his eyes, staring into the blackness. He could not see anything, but the hairs on his arms stood up. The air in the cellar grew suddenly freezing cold. It was not the chill of the storm. It was an unnatural, creeping frost. Nick felt the undeniable sensation of being watched. He imagined a figure standing in the corner of the cellar, a man made of shadows, with eyes that burned like red coals in the dark. The presence radiated a distinct, malicious amusement. It was waiting. It was studying them. This presence was Randall Flagg, but Flagg was merely one face of a timeless cosmic entity known across the multiverse as Walter O'Dim, the Man in Black, or the Ageless Stranger. He is an emissary of the Crimson King, a literal force of evil who hops between dimensions, thriving wherever the order of the universe falls apart. Down in the cellar, he wasn't just watching Nick and Tom, he was testing the spiritual weight of his new prey. Nick tightened his grip on Tom, fighting the urge to thrash blindly in the dark. The vibration above them slowly began to fade. The pressure in the air eased. Tom pushed away from Nick and scrambled up the stairs. He threw open the cellar door. Sunlight poured into the cellar, blinding them for a moment. Nick followed Tom up the stairs. They stepped out into the yard and stared in shock. The farmhouse was gone, and the barn was stripped bare. The tornado had torn the roof off completely, leaving nothing but the picked skeleton of the building. The trees in the yard had been snapped in half, their trunks jagged and white. The storm had moved on, leaving a trail of scoured earth behind it. Tom stood shivering in the sunlight, staring at the empty foundation. "Someone was in there," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Not just us. Someone else." Nick placed a reassuring hand on Tom's arm, but internally Nick agreed. He had felt it too. The storm had passed, but it left behind a lingering dread, a sense that the empty world was not as empty as it seemed. This isn't just thematic parallel, it's confirmed geography. Later, Dark Tower books place a version of Topeka, Kansas, reached through a thinny, a tear between worlds, on the exact Earth depicted in The Stand, and Roland's own quartet passes through it, the wasteland. Nick and Tom are biking across isn't a metaphor for another level of the tower. In King's later books, it literally is one. The survivors were scattered across a ruined continent, navigating the debris of a fallen civilization. They had outlived the virus, surviving the coughing fits and the swollen throats. They had walked out of plague centers, crawled through dark tunnels, and hidden in cellars, while the wind tore the earth apart. They were alive, but they were adrift. As they scavenged for food in empty supermarkets and slept in abandoned homes, they began to realize the true nature of their situation. The machinery of mankind had stopped, the laws had evaporated, the social contracts were null and void. They had to figure out how to find water, how to stay warm, and how to deal with the vast, quiet emptiness that surrounded them. But as the physical challenges mounted, a new, more mysterious phenomenon began to unite them. When the sun went down and the survivors closed their eyes, the silence of the world was replaced by a crowded landscape of the mind. The dreams began to arrive. They slipped into the sleep of every immune person left alive. The dreams were vivid, terrifying, and impossible to ignore, drawing the scattered remnants of humanity toward a conflict that defied logic and science. Chapter 2. The Two Voices. The noise of the 20th century faded into a thick, ringing silence. When the bioengineered virus known as Captain Trips scoured the globe, it left behind a landscape stripped of its buzzing, humming vitality. The highways sat empty, choked with miles of stalled cars containing the decaying remains of those who tried to flee. The power grids failed, plunging cities into darkness. The television screens broadcast nothing but dead air. For the immune survivors scattered across the American continent, the silence became a tangible thing, pressing against their eardrums and isolating them in a vast, ruined world. During the waking hours, these survivors scavenged for canned food, siphoned gasoline from abandoned vehicles, and navigated streets littered with the dead. But it was at night that their new reality truly took hold. The apocalypse had wiped the slate clean, turning the minds of the survivors into blank canvases. Soon, something began to paint upon them. The dreams arrived. They were not the disjointed, fragmented images born from trauma or stress. These visions possessed a sharp, undeniable clarity. They were shared broadcasts, sweeping across the country and slipping into the sleep of every immune person left alive. Through these nightly visions, the scattered remnants of humanity were being summoned, sorted, and tested. The survivors found themselves pulled between two competing signals, each one sorting the living by what they already carried inside them. The first voice came wrapped in the scent of summer earth and growing things. Survivors would close their eyes and find themselves standing on a dirt road, surrounded by an endless sea of green corn under a flawless blue sky. The wind rustled through the sword-like blades of the cornstalks. Up ahead, in a small clearing, sat a weathered wooden shack resting on old jacklifters. An ancient apple tree shaded the yard, holding a worn tire swing that moved back and forth in the breeze. Sitting on the porch of the shack was a frail, elderly black woman with thin white hair. She wore a simple house dress and wire-rimmed spectacles. Her face was seamed with a million wrinkles, resembling a map of a territory where the geography had not yet settled down. She cradled an old acoustic guitar in her lap, plucking out the melodies of old-time spirituals. "Jesus, won't you come by here?" she would sing, her voice carrying the rough, comforting texture of dark leather. "'Cause now is the needy time." She would look up from her guitar, her eyes bright and filled with an ancient, knowing light. She did not demand, she invited. "Mother Abigail is what they call me," she told the dreamers. I still make my own biscuits. You come see me anytime and bring your friends." For Nick Andros, the deaf-mute drifter who had survived the plague in Arkansas, the dream of Mother Abigail brought a staggering revelation. In the waking world, Nick lived in a muted reality, communicating only through written notes and gestures. But when he walked through the dream cornfield toward the shack on jacklifters, he heard the rustle of the wind. He heard the chiming, rhythmic notes of the guitar. When the old woman asked him a question, Nick opened his mouth and realized he could speak. His own voice sounded clear and beautiful to his ears. The experience brought tears to his eyes, offering a sense of healing and purpose that he had never known. Mother Abigail was a real woman living in the small farming community of Hemingford Home, Nebraska. Born Abigail Fremantle in the year 1882, she was 108 years old when the superflu struck. She was the daughter of freed slaves who had settled in the Midwest. Her father, John Fremantle, had purchased their land piece by piece, overcoming the prejudices of his neighbors through sheer willpower and agricultural skill. Abigail remembered the magic year of 1902, when, newly married and 3 months pregnant with her first child, she stepped onto the stage of the Grange Hall, ignoring the hostile glares of the crowd, and played her guitar. She sang hymns and Civil War ballads, finishing with a rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner that brought the audience to their feet in a thunderous ovation. It's worth pausing on the shape of that. An elderly black woman, daughter of freed slaves, singing scripture to a hostile crowd until they're on their feet, decades before she does something similar for a shattered nation. Abigail is written closer to an Old Testament prophet than a typical king protagonist, which is part of why her death scene plays like a commissioning rather than a character exit. She had outlived 3 husbands and all of her children. Now, at the end of her long life, God had given her a new task. She did not want the burden. Her joints ached with arthritis, and she wished only to pass her final days resting in her rocking chair. But the voice of the Lord spoke to her in the quiet moments, instructing her to keep her oil lamps filled and her pantry stocked. She was the earthly beacon for the good-hearted survivors, drawing them toward Hemingford Home and eventually toward the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. In the grand cosmology, Hemingford Home was no random destination. It served as a thin place, a nexus point bordering the path of the beam, where the spiritual force known as the White could directly counteract the encroaching darkness. Mother Abigail was an instrument of Gan, the cosmic spirit of the White, standing as the counterbalance to the chaotic evil trying to claim this level of the tower. But there was another voice broadcasting through the night, bringing with it a tide of suffocating terror. While Mother Abigail offered comfort and community, the second dreamer offered power, order, and submission. Survivors would fall asleep and find themselves standing on the edge of a dizzying precipice or lost in a maze of dark, echoing corridors. The air in these dreams smelled of brimstone, ozone, and coal dust. Standing in the shadows was the shape of a man. Sometimes he wore a monk's cowl, obscuring his features in a void of darkness. Other times he appeared as a tall figure in faded pegged jeans, a denim jacket, and run-down cowboy boots. 2 buttons adorned his jacket, a yellow smiley face on the right, and a pig wearing a policeman's cap on the left, bearing the legend, "How's your pork?" in red, dripping letters. This was Randall Flagg, the walking dude, the dark man. Yet Flagg was not merely a warlord of the wasteland. He was an ancient, interdimensional sorcerer, a servant of the Crimson King who thrived wherever the order of the universe fell apart. Sociologist Glenn Bateman would eventually theorize that Flagg was an avatar of Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, a Lovecraftian outer god of incredible power and silver-tongued deception who traveled between realities to drag civilizations into ruin. When Flagg appeared in the dreams, the survivors felt an icy dread crawl up their spines. He possessed no face, only a pair of burning red eyes that glared from the shadows. His presence caused the temperature to drop, bringing a freezing cold that felt like a physical blow. He did not invite. He commanded. "I will set you high in my artillery," he whispered to the dreamers, his voice carrying the deceptive charm of a seasoned politician. "You are the man I want." Flag stalked the empty highways of the American West, a supernatural entity thriving on the chaos of the fallen world. His origins were shrouded in a hazy fog of violence and upheaval. He remembered fragments of the past decades, riding with the Ku Klux Klan, handing out flyers alongside Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans, walking the streets during civil rights riots. King has said part of Flag's concept came from Donald DeFreeze, the escaped convict who led the Symbionese Liberation Army and orchestrated Patty Hearst's kidnapping, another charismatic figure who built a following out of alienated people during the chaos of the mid-1970s. Flag's fictional resume of real atrocities isn't just texture. It's King grounding a supernatural villain in the decade's actual anxieties. It's also worth noticing what kind of power actually runs Las Vegas once Flag has it, because most of it isn't supernatural at all. Public executions staged as spectacle, controlled information, followers kept fed, armed, and just afraid enough of each other to police themselves. Hannah Arendt coined the phrase banality of evil for exactly this, atrocity carried out through ordinary compliance rather than monstrous will. Flag has real dark magic on tap. The Empire itself runs on something older and much more human. He was a creature of the dark, capable of levitating above the ground and projecting his vision into the minds of animals. He controlled the scavengers of the wasteland. Crows watched the survivors from telephone wires, acting as his spies. Timber wolves padded through the snow and sand, serving as his executioners. The crows as spies detail is doing more than set dressing. It's King reaching into a much older tradition of folk horror, where a witch or sorcerer's authority is measured by which animals will serve them. In that older sense, a familiar isn't a pet. It's proof that the natural order itself has taken a side. Having crows and wolves answer to Flag is King's shorthand for something he never states outright. Nature finds this man more trustworthy than it finds the rest of us. The dreams sent by Flag were personalized nightmares, tailored to exploit the deepest fears of those who received them. Stuart Redman dreamed of walking down an endless desert highway, finding people he knew crucified on telephone poles. Franny Goldsmith, the pregnant college student from Maine, suffered recurring terrors of the dark man chasing her through a shadowy house. In her dream, Flag cornered her, holding a twisted wire coat hanger, grinning a hateful smile as he reached for her unborn child. The psychic broadcasts forced the survivors to choose. The dreams acted as a relentless sorting mechanism. For Nadine Cross, however, the sorting had begun long before the plague. During her college years, an incident with a Ouija board planchette had spelled out a terrifying occult prophecy, claiming her as an unbroken vessel for a dark king. The superflu simply activated that long-dormant curse, turning her into a pawn destined to become the bride of Flag, cementing a demonic bloodline meant to plunge this world into eternal night. What makes Nadine's arc land harder than a standard chosen bride plot is the timing. Her fate was sealed in college, years before she had any say in the matter, and decades before Flag is even active in this world. Every choice she makes afterward, resisting Larry, resisting her own revulsion, is a person fighting a decision that was never hers to make. It's the book's bleakest illustration of its own central tension between Kay and free will. Those who sought peace, democracy, and connection packed their meager belongings and turned their faces toward Nebraska, seeking the old woman in the corn. But those harboring deep resentments, those who craved authority or those simply broken by fear, felt the magnetic pull of the dark man. They headed west, drawn toward the neon graveyard of Las Vegas, Nevada, where Flag was building an empire of blood and iron. For a petty criminal named Lloyd Henraid, the choice was made in the agonizing depths of a locked prison cell. Before the superflu wiped out the population, Lloyd had been riding shotgun on a chaotic, multi-state crime spree with a volatile partner named Poke Freeman. Their run ended when a botched robbery turned deadly. An armed customer shot Poke in the face, and a store clerk finished him off with a shotgun blast. Lloyd was taken into custody and locked inside the Phoenix Municipal Jail, facing the prospect of the electric chair. When Captain Trips infiltrated the prison, the guards and inmates died in their cells, coughing and strangling on their own fluids. Lloyd was left alone in maximum security, trapped behind bars operated by a dead electrical grid. The days stretched into a torment of starvation and thirst. The smell of the decaying bodies in the neighboring cells filled the air. Lloyd conserved the small amount of food he had hidden under his mattress, but it vanished too quickly. He drank the rusty water from his toilet bowl. He managed to trap a cockroach under his shoe and ate it alive, feeling its legs scratching against his tongue before he bit down. Desperation pushed Lloyd toward the brink of madness. In the cell to his right lay the body of an inmate named Trask. As the hunger twisted his stomach into knots, Lloyd spent hours using his raw, bleeding fingers to unthread a bolt from his metal cot. When he finally freed a heavy metal bar, he used it to smash a rat that had come to feed on Trask's remains. He hid the dead rat under his mattress, a grim insurance policy. But the dark, forbidden thought of consuming his dead cellmate began to dominate his waking hours. He used the metal bar to drag Trask's body closer to the bars of his cell, fighting waves of revulsion and guilt. It's worth being precise about what actually turns Lloyd into Flag's loyal second. Not ideology and not fear alone. Flag arrives at the exact moment starvation has stripped Lloyd down to nothing and simply ends it. That's textbook trauma bonding. Total devotion to whoever ends unbearable suffering, regardless of what they are. It's why Lloyd's loyalty never wavers, even watching Flag's cruelty firsthand. And it's the same psychology that has him pulling the trigger on Glenn Bateman later, without ever really deciding to. Lloyd was sitting on his bunk, his mind slipping into delirium, when he heard the rhythmic, clicking sound of boot heels walking down the corridor. A voice called out, echoing against the steel walls. "Hoo-hoo! Anybody home?" Lloyd gripped the bars of his cell, his eyes wide and sunken in his skeletal face. The footsteps stopped in front of his cage. Standing in the shadows was a man in a faded denim jacket. The man possessed a ruddy, handsome face, but his eyes burned with a dark, dancing glee. "You look like an advertisement for a summer vacation at Dachau," the man said smoothly. Lloyd begged for his life. He pleaded for food. He cried, staring at the stranger's hands. The man held a small, dark stone between his fingers. The stone was black as jet, marked with a single red flaw in the center that looked like a bloody, half-open eye. This dark, hypnotic stone pulsed with a malevolent cosmic radiation, akin to Black 13 and other cursed artifacts used by the Crimson King to bend weak minds. It was a physical manifestation of Tadash space, pulling Lloyd's fractured sanity into Flag's absolute control. "I'm going to make you my right-hand man, Lloyd," the stranger said. "I'll give you the key if you give me your promise." "I promise," Lloyd rasped, his voice a dry croak. The stranger closed his fist around the dark stone. When he opened his hand again, the stone was gone. In its place lay a flat silver key. "The name is Flag," the man said, sliding the key into the electronic lockbox of the cell door. The mechanism clicked, and the heavy door slid open. "Shall we get some dinner? We have a lot of driving to do tonight." Lloyd stumbled out of the cell, leaving the nightmare behind. He looked at Randall Flagg with a mixture of terror and deep, reverent love. Flagg had delivered him from death, and in return, Lloyd handed over his soul. He became the Dark Man's most loyal lieutenant, the second in command of the growing army in Las Vegas. What happens to Lloyd becomes Flagg's actual playbook, not just his origin story. Every major recruit we meet in Vegas is found at their single worst, most physically depleted moment, starving, burned, disfigured, humiliated. Cult researchers have a term for this, a recruitment window, the observation that ideological conversion happens far more easily during acute crisis than at any calmer moment, because crisis temporarily switches off the skepticism a person would normally bring to an obviously bad deal. Flagg isn't persuasive, in other words, he's just unnervingly good at timing. While Lloyd was pulled from his cell on death row, another of Flagg's key recruits was forging his own path through the ruined world, driven by a lifelong obsession with fire. His name was Donald Merwin Elbert, but the residents of his hometown in Powtonville, Indiana, knew him as the Trash Can Man. Donald had endured a brutal life. His father, in a psychotic break, had murdered a bartender and 3 of Donald's siblings before being shot dead by the local sheriff, who later married Donald's mother and became his stepfather. Tormented by the town's bullies and plagued by voices in his head, Donald found solace in the mesmerizing, destructive power of flames. As a boy, he set fires in trash cans and was sent to an institution in Terre Haute, where he endured agonizing electroshock therapy that scrambled his memories and worsened his mental instability. Years later, as a teenager, he torched the local Methodist church and was sent to prison for arson. The institutional detail here isn't incidental. Mid-century psychiatric care for at-risk kids leaned heavily on containment over treatment, electroshock, among the tools used as much to manage behavior as to heal anything. A traumatized child who set fires got warehoused and shocked, not treated, and came out more damaged than he went in. King doesn't spell out the critique, but the pipeline he's describing, abuse, institutionalization, more abuse, prison, is a real and documented one. It's what makes Trash Can Man read less like a monster and more like a systems finished product. When the superflu wiped out the guards and doctors at the prison where he was serving time, the Trash Can Man walked free. He returned to his hometown, his mind a fractured landscape of old traumas. Finding the town empty, he turned his attention to the massive white storage tanks of the Cheery Oil Company on the outskirts of his own hometown. With the meticulous focus of an idiot savant, Trash Can Man bypassed the security fences, climbed the steel stairs to the top of the tanks, and rigged crude incendiary devices. When the first tank exploded, the shockwave knocked him to the ground. As he fled, he vaulted over a stairway railing and shattered his wrist on landing. Left unset, the bone would heal crooked, twisting his hand permanently outward. The pain was unimaginable. He stumbled away from the refinery screaming as the remaining tanks detonated in a chain reaction, sending a pillar of fire into the night sky that turned the clouds a bruised, hellish orange. Delirious from the pain of his burns, Trash Can Man collapsed in a local park. As he drifted into unconsciousness, the Dark Man came to him in a dream. Flagg stood on a high peak, looking down at a country consumed by flames. He turned his burning eyes toward the Trash Can Man. "I will set you high in my artillery," Flagg promised. "You are the man I want." Weeks later, setting a second fire in the city of Gary, Indiana, a timing device ignited early and sprayed burning fuel across his left arm. The vision provided the Trash Can Man with a singular, overriding purpose. He treated his rotting, burned arm with stolen morphine and packed it in a thick layer of Vaseline. Driven by the hypnotic command of his new master, he began a grueling trek westward. But Flagg's reliance on the Trash Can Man was the Dark Man's greatest unperceived weakness. Flagg, as a creature of calculated evil and control, possessed a supernatural hubris that blinded him to pure, unpredictable chaos. The Trash Can Man was entirely untethered from sanity, operating on a frequency of pure pyromaniacal madness that Flagg's psychic eye could never fully predict or tame. He rode a stolen bicycle across the plains, pedaling under the blistering summer sun. The morphine dulled the agony of his burns, inducing a euphoric state where he hummed to himself, his eyes gleaming with mad devotion. He crossed the Mississippi River, navigating the empty highways, his mind fixed on reaching the Dark Man's kingdom. As he traveled through the Midwest, the dreams of Mother Abigail attempted to reach him. The trashcan man saw the green cornfields and the old woman on the porch, but the vision filled him with revulsion and fear. When the old woman looked at him, he felt himself transforming into a slinking, cowardly weasel. He screamed himself awake, terrified by the purity of her light. He pushed harder, fleeing across Nebraska and into Colorado, desperate to escape the reach of the old woman's influence. After surviving a harrowing encounter with a psychotic gun-toting survivor known only as the Kid, the trashcan man finally crossed the border into Nevada. The desert heat baked his skin, peeling the sunburned layers away until his face resembled a cracked red landscape. His shoes fell apart, forcing him to bind them together with twine. His body wasted away from dehydration and exhaustion. But as he crested a final hill on the interstate, he looked down and saw his destination. The city of Las Vegas shimmered in the desert valley. To the trashcan man, it was Cibola, the fabled city of gold. He staggered down the highway, his run-down shoes slapping against the pavement. He passed the abandoned casinos on the strip, his eyes wide with awe. He collapsed near the entrance of the MGM Grand, dragging himself toward the ornate colored fountains splashing in the courtyard. He plunged his burned, emaciated body into the water, drinking greedily, weeping with joy. He had arrived. The Dark Man's weapons expert had come home to burn the world. While Flag gathered his broken, dangerous disciples in the desert, the survivors who had chosen the path of light were slowly converging on the small farming town of Hemingford Home, Nebraska. Stu Redman traveled with Glenn Bateman, the gray-haired sociology professor who provided a cynical but steadying perspective on the collapse of humanity. They were accompanied by Franny Goldsmith, who carried the secret of her pregnancy, and Harold Lauder. Harold was a tragic, dangerous figure. Before the plague, he had been an overweight, acne-scarred teenager, ignored by his peers and overshadowed by his popular older sister. When the virus took his family, Harold found himself alone with Franny, the girl he had secretly loved from afar. He appointed himself her protector, envisioning a future where he would rebuild society with Franny by his side. But the arrival of Stu Redman shattered Harold's fantasies. Franny gravitated towards Stu's quiet strength, leaving Harold feeling discarded and humiliated once again. Harold masked his seething jealousy behind a facade of eager cooperation. He painted signs on barn roofs to guide other survivors, scavenged for supplies, and maintained a polite, smiling exterior. But beneath the smile, a cold hatred was taking root. Harold watched Stu and Franny, his mind calculating equations of revenge. The group traveled across the empty highways, riding motorcycles scavenged from abandoned dealerships. The journey was a somber procession through a graveyard. They passed towns where the stench of the dead forced them to wear bandanas over their faces. They navigated traffic jams of rusted cars, swerving around the vehicles that served as tombs for families who had died trying to escape the inevitable. When they finally reached the dirt road leading to Mother Abigail's farm, they found the old woman sitting on her porch, her cane resting between her knees. Other groups had already arrived, drawn by the same psychic beacon. Nick Andros was there, communicating with his notebook, alongside Tom Cullen, who chased crows through the cornfields with childlike glee. A country veterinarian named Dick Ellis and a woman named Olivia Walker had also found their way to the farm. The scattered embers of humanity had sparked into a small fire. Mother Abigail welcomed them, her eyes shining with warmth. She fed them fresh chicken and corn, providing a brief, beautiful moment of respite. But the shadow of the Dark Man loomed over their gathering. Sitting in her kitchen, bathed in the soft glow of an oil lamp, Mother Abigail spoke to Stu and Nick about the adversary in the west. "He's the purest evil left in the world," she warned them, her voice dropping to a husky whisper. "He's getting them together a lot faster than we are. The weak ones, the lonely ones, the ones that have left God out of their hearts." She told the assembled survivors that their journey was not over. Hemmingford Home was not a fortress. It was merely a waypoint. The Lord's plan required them to move further west, to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. They were to establish a permanent settlement in Boulder, Colorado. "There's bitter days ahead," Mother Abigail said, her gaze resting heavily on the young faces surrounding her table. "Death and terror, betrayal and tears, and not all of us will be alive to see how it ends." The survivors packed their gear into scavenged trucks and vans. They left the quiet safety of the cornfields behind, driving toward the jagged blue peaks of the Rockies. They were embarking on the monumental task of rebuilding a society from the ashes of the old world, carrying the heavy burden of survival and the creeping dread of the war that was sure to come. They hoped to find a sanctuary in Boulder. They hoped to build a free zone where they could restore the rule of law, turn the electricity back on, and prepare for the birth of the first post-plague children. They believed that their collective goodwill could shield them from the gathering storm. But across the mountains, in the neon-lit fortress of Las Vegas, the dark man was smiling. He was watching the roads. He was whispering into the ears of his followers. He was readying his weapons. And he knew that the true battle for the soul of the world had only just begun. Chapter 3. The Gathering in Boulder. By the time the scattered survivors reached Boulder, Colorado, Mother Abigail's flock had grown considerably, drawn in from every direction by the same pull toward her voice. The city sat nestled in a valley, guarded by the imposing rock formations known as the Flatirons. When the first groups arrived, the air held a crisp, clean scent of pine, untainted by the smog that had once choked the region. Boulder was a ghost town, frozen in the agonizing weeks of the summer, when the shifting-antigen virus had swept through the population. The streets were choked with stalled vehicles, and the homes sat silent, their shades drawn tight against the world. The survivors who drove into the city limits faced an overwhelming task. They were a diverse, traumatized collection of individuals: factory workers, college students, musicians, sociologists, and drifters. They had to transform a sprawling tomb into a functioning society before the harsh mountain winter descended upon them. The population of the newly named Boulder Free Zone swelled by the day. People arrived in cars, on motorcycles, and on foot, drawn by the psychic broadcasts that had filled their sleep. To manage the influx and prevent societal collapse, the community established the Free Zone Committee. The leadership included Stuart Redman, the pragmatic Texan; Franny Goldsmith, the resilient young woman carrying an unborn child; Glenn Bateman, the cynical but wise academic; Larry Underwood, the former rock musician; Nick Andros, the deaf-mute visionary; Ralph Brentner, a resourceful farmer; and Susan Stern, a sharp-witted political activist. They held public meetings at the Chautauqua Auditorium, a vast wooden structure that echoed with the voices of hundreds seeking guidance. They ratified the Constitution, voted on civil laws, and began the arduous process of assigning labor. The illusion of safety began to take root as people claimed abandoned houses, sweeping away the dust and trying to forget the horrors they had witnessed on the highways. But the reality of their situation was grim, and the pressing logistical nightmares required immediate, grueling attention. Before the survivors could truly inhabit Boulder, they had to address the thousands of decaying bodies left behind by the pandemic. The virus had struck during the peak of summer, and the resulting decay posed a severe threat to the community's health. The committee formed a burial detail, placing a reluctant former undertaker named Chad Norris in charge. The work was grueling and macabre. Men donned thick rubber suits and gas masks to shield themselves from the suffocating stench. They moved from house to house, carrying out the fluid-leaking remains of the city's former residents. The bodies were loaded into the beds of orange municipal dump trucks and driven to an abandoned strip mine 10 miles outside the city limits. There, the workers laid out vast sheets of plastic, dumping the remains into mass graves before covering them with earth using heavy bulldozers. The sound of loose change falling from the pockets of the dead as they struck the plastic sheeting, became a haunting auditory memory for the workers, a daily reminder of the fragility of their new existence. It's worth sitting with how unglamorous this stretch of the book is. King spends more time on body disposal logistics and blown transformers than on demons, and that's the point. Before Boulder can be a battleground for cosmic good and evil, it first has to be a town with working sewage and a burial plan. The supernatural horror got the world into this. Getting out of it is just work. While the burial detail cleared the rot from the homes, another crew tackled the infrastructure. Brad Kitchener, an electrician, led a team to the local hydroelectric power plant. Their goal was to restore electricity to the grid, but the process was fraught with danger. If they reactivated the turbines while thousands of household appliances remained plugged in across the city, the resulting power surge could ignite a catastrophic firestorm. When they finally tested the generators, the hum of electricity brought a brief moment of triumph, followed by a shower of sparks and a blown transformer caused by appliances left plugged in across the city. Realizing their mistake, they quickly formed a turning-off crew to scour every building and manually flip breaker switches in darkened basements. The victory was hard-fought, requiring endless days of rewiring and scrubbing burned-out motors. It's a small, unglamorous moment, but it's doing some of the book's quiet political work. The Free Zone Committee is elected, but the people actually keeping Boulder alive in these early weeks, Kitchener, Norris, the burial crews, are chosen for competence, not popularity. It's the same point Glenn Bateman will make out loud a few chapters later. A society survives on expertise long before it survives on democracy. Las Vegas runs on Flag's charisma. Boulder runs on people who know how to rewire a transformer without burning the town down. Beneath the surface of this frantic rebuilding, deep psychological fractures began to open in the leadership. The most dangerous fissure existed within the mind of Harold Lauder. Harold had survived the initial outbreak alongside Franny Goldsmith. He harbored an obsessive, suffocating infatuation with her, viewing her as his destined partner in the new world. But Franny's affections had shifted to Stuart Redman, a man whose quiet competence and easy charm highlighted all of Harold's insecurities. Harold felt discarded, a brilliant mind relegated to the sidelines, while a mere factory worker claimed the woman he desired and a seat on the governing committee. Behind the same cooperative reputation, he showed the free zone. The resentment Harold had nursed since Boulder's earliest days, alone in his house on Arapahoe Street, had only sharpened. The breaking point arrived when he snuck into Franny's belongings and read her private diary. The pages revealed her true feelings, her undeniable love for Stu, her pregnancy by a man from her past, and her lingering unease around Harold himself. The rejection shattered the last remnants of Harold's morality. He purchased a leather-bound ledger and began writing a manifesto of vengeance. His handwriting, meticulous and tiny, filled the pages with venomous declarations against the Free Zone Committee. He embraced his anger, viewing his exclusion not as a personal failure, but as a symptom of a flawed society that refused to recognize his genius. Sociologists have a name for this exact pattern. Michael Kimmel calls it aggrieved entitlement. A sense that benefits someone believed were their due have been snatched away from them. Harold doesn't turn dangerous because the world was cruel to him. He turns dangerous because he'd already decided, long before Franny chose Stu, that her kindness was owed to him. Harold is one of the more quietly unsettling things King ever wrote, precisely because there's no supernatural excuse for him. Flag finds him. He doesn't make him. The shape of his grievance, the secret ledger of resentments, the conviction that unrewarded kindness was owed to him, the slide from performing friendliness to plotting murder, reads uncomfortably more familiar to a 2026 audience than it did in 1978. It's a formal choice as much as a character one. King actually shifts prose style for Harold's sections, dropping into the clipped, self-consciously literary voice of Harold's own diary, so we get his resentment in his own words before it curdles into violence. The dark man in the west sensed this festering wound and began to whisper into Harold's mind, stoking the fires of betrayal. Flagg recognized Harold as the perfect pawn, a prototypical resentful outcast, vibrating with the exact frequency of entitled anger that the Crimson King's agents had exploited across countless worlds. The dark man amplified Harold's feelings of victimhood, turning his toxic jealousy into a psychic weapon meant to shatter the quartet of the free zone before it could fully form. Harold was not the only resident of Boulder susceptible to the shadows. Nadine Cross, a former schoolteacher, carried a terrible burden. Since her college years, she had felt a cold, magnetic pull toward an unseen destiny. When she played with a planchette on a spirit board, it had spelled out terrifying messages, claiming her as a bride for a dark king. As the superflu decimated the globe, the psychic dreams of Randall Flagg amplified that old prophecy. She felt an icy compulsion to join him, to become the mother of his demonic heir. Desperate to break the curse, Nadine attempted to forge a normal connection. She went to Larry Underwood in the dead of night, begging him to sleep with her, hoping that the act of intimacy would sever her mystical tie to Flagg. Larry, sensing the chaotic desperation in her request and harboring his own feelings of inadequacy, turned her away. The rejection sealed her fate. Isolated and terrified of the destiny she could not escape, Nadine sought out Harold Lauder. They were two outcasts, bound together by rejection and the insidious whispers of Randall Flagg. Nadine arrived at Harold's house, offering him the sexual validation he had always craved, but with a cruel condition. He could have everything except her ultimate innocence, which belonged solely to the dark man. In exchange, Harold agreed to execute a horrific plan. Flagg did not want a military skirmish. He wanted the heart of the free zone ripped out. While Harold and Nadine conspired in the shadows, the Free Zone Committee faced a critical dilemma. The dreams of the dark man had faded, replaced by a lingering, ominous dread. They knew an adversary was building an empire in Las Vegas, but they had no intelligence regarding his numbers, his weapons, or his intentions. During a tense closed-door session, Nick Andros proposed a desperate strategy. They needed to send spies across the Rocky Mountains. The selection process was agonizing. They could not send their strongest leaders without arousing suspicion or weakening their own fragile government. Larry Underwood nominated Judge Farris, a 70-year-old man whose age would provide a natural cover story. Susan Stern nominated Dinah Juergens, a resilient and fiercely intelligent woman capable of handling herself in dangerous territory. The most controversial suggestion came from Nick Andros, who nominated Tom Cullen. The committee balked at the idea of sending a developmentally disabled man into a hostile war zone. But Nick argued that Tom's condition was his greatest asset. Flagg's forces would never suspect a man with a childlike mind of being a spy. Furthermore, Nick revealed that Tom possessed a unique susceptibility to hypnosis. During a session with a local resident skilled in the practice, Nick implanted a solid cover story deep within Tom's subconscious. If interrogated, Tom would truthfully believe he had been driven out of Boulder because the community deemed him unfit. Nick also planted a post-hypnotic trigger. When the moon was full, Tom would feel an irresistible urge to return home. The three spies departed Boulder in secret, taking separate routes to avoid connecting their missions. They vanished into the vast, empty expanse of the American West, leaving the committee to wait in agonizing suspense. Across the mountains, the city of Las Vegas operated under a chillingly different paradigm. Randall Flagg had transformed the neon playground into a hub of militant efficiency. The streets were cleared of debris, the casinos were repurposed into barracks and supply depots, and the populace lived under the constant, suffocating weight of fear. Flagg's right-hand man, Lloyd Henraid, oversaw the daily operations, while the trash can man, serving as the chief weapons scavenger, scoured the desert for military hardware, bringing back incendiary devices, landmines, and even fighter jets from the nearby Indian Springs Air Base. Flagg ruled through a combination of supernatural terror and brutal public executions. Those who disobeyed his edicts or succumbed to drug addiction were crucified on wooden crosses erected in front of the MGM Grand, left to bake under the relentless desert sun. The Dark Man's psychic awareness allowed him to monitor his domain, sensing dissent before it could take root. When the Free Zone spies breached his territory, Flag felt their presence. He dispatched his border guards with precise instructions. Judge Farris was intercepted on a rainy highway near the Idaho-Oregon border. Flag had ordered the judge to be taken alive or killed without damaging his face, intending to send the severed head back to Boulder as a gruesome warning. But the ambush went wrong. Flag's other guard, Roberts, shot the judge in the stomach at close range, and a panicked Bobby Terry accidentally killed Roberts with a stray shot before firing 2 direct rounds into the judge's face, destroying the Dark Man's prize. When Flag discovered the failure, he tracked Bobby Terry into the desert and tore the man apart with his bare hands, showcasing a feral, uncontrollable rage. This was not mere anger, but a terrifying unraveling of his human disguise, as his true, monstrous face briefly bled through the facade. As the cosmic order of his regime faced the unpredictable chaos of the Free Zone spies, Flag's calculated glamour slipped, exposing the terrified, chaotic demon beneath. A servant of the outer dark, losing his grip on a reality he thought he commanded. Dana Jurgen successfully infiltrated Las Vegas, integrating herself into the workforce and eventually sharing a bed with Lloyd Henrade. She gathered vital intelligence about the fighter jets and the weapon stockpiles, but she quickly realized that Flag's psychic net was tightening. The Dark Man summoned her to his penthouse suite. The confrontation was a clash of wills. Flag attempted to charm her, presenting himself as a reasonable leader seeking peace, but Dinah saw through the facade. She recognized the cold reptilian emptiness behind his smile. Flag demanded the name of the third spy. He used his supernatural influence, trying to pry the information from her mind. Dinah, realizing she could not withstand his psychic assault indefinitely, made a final, defiant choice. She rammed herself headfirst into the thick glass of the penthouse window. It didn't fully give way, and as she twisted against its jagged edges, the glass tore into her throat and eye. She died bleeding on the carpet, taking Tom Cullen's identity to the grave. Dana doesn't get the interior chapters Franny or Nadine get, but her death is doing real work in the story. She's arguably the first person to beat Flag outright, not by escaping him, but by taking the one thing he wants and putting it permanently out of reach. It's a brutal, compressed demonstration of the rule the whole Vegas plot runs on. Flag's power depends on the belief that he can eventually get anything from anyone. Dana is the first proof in the book that he can't. Flag's reaction was one of unprecedented fury. He kicked Dana's lifeless body across the room, howling in frustration. The Dark Man, who prided himself on absolute omniscience, had been thwarted by a mere mortal. More troubling, his psychic vision remained frustratingly blind to the third spy. Because Tom Cullen operated on a different cognitive frequency, his mind did not register on Flag's radar. When placed under hypnosis back in Boulder, Tom's mind peeled back to reveal a profound psychic state calling itself God's Tom, possessing a clairvoyant foresight akin to Mother Abigail's. In the cosmic war between the white and the outer dark, pure innocence provides a literal psychic shield. Flag's demonic, all-seeing eye was entirely blinded by the untainted light of Tom's mind, exposing a fatal flaw in the Dark Man's supernatural omniscience. The failure exposed a critical vulnerability in the Dark Man's power, sowing seeds of doubt among his closest lieutenants. Back in Boulder, the sense of impending doom thickened. The spiritual anchor of the community, Mother Abigail, had vanished. Plagued by dreams of weasels attacking her chickens and a red-eyed wolf stalking her in the corn, the old woman realized she had fallen victim to the sin of pride. She had allowed the survivors to revere her, placing herself between them and God. To seek forgiveness and clarity, she left a note and walked out into the untamed wilderness beyond the city limits. The wilderness trial is one of the oldest shapes in religious storytelling, Moses on the mountain, Jesus in the desert, the Buddha under the tree. In every version, the leader has to leave the community that depends on them and prove, alone and unwitnessed, that their authority comes from somewhere other than the community's belief in them. King is running Mother Abigail through the same structure and pointedly keeps the reader outside it. We get her guilt and her return, not the ordeal itself, which is part of why she still feels a little unknowable right up until the deathbed scene that follows. In the macroverse, this was a grueling but necessary spiritual trial, a stripping away of the ego to directly commune with Gan, the spirit of the white. By surrendering herself to the brutal elements and facing the psychic manifestations of Flag's familiars in the wilderness, she was attempting to realign herself with Kai, accepting that she was merely a vessel for destiny, not its architect. Her disappearance sent ripples of anxiety through the free zone. Search parties scoured the foothills, calling her name into the empty canyons, but they found no trace. Without her guiding presence, the committee felt adrift, questioning the morality of their decisions and the true nature of the battle ahead. Harold Lauder saw the ensuing confusion as the perfect opportunity to strike. With Nadine's assistance, Harold gathered sticks of dynamite scavenged from a nearby construction site. He utilized a circuit board from a remote-controlled toy and wired it to a realistic walkie-talkie, creating a lethal remote-detonated explosive. The plan was meticulous. The committee was scheduled to hold a private meeting at the house shared by Nick Andros and Ralph Brentner. Harold and Nadine would plant the bomb in a hallway closet, ride their motorcycles up the winding road to Flagstaff Mountain, and trigger the device from a safe distance, obliterating the leadership of the free zone in a single devastating blast. On the evening of the meeting, the committee gathered in the living room. Stu, Fran, Larry, Glenn, Nick, Ralph and Susan Stern sat discussing the logistics of the census and the restoration of the power grid. Outside, the night air was cool and still. Nadine had slipped into the house earlier in the day, hiding the shoebox containing the bomb behind a pile of winter coats in the closet. She rode up the mountain with Harold, her heart hammering against her ribs, torn between the terrifying pull of her dark destiny and the lingering echoes of her own conscience. In the house, the meeting proceeded. Nick Andros communicated through handwritten notes, debating the nuances of law and order in their fledgling society. Larry Underwood felt a gnawing unease, a subconscious dread that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Franny Goldsmith shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her hands resting protectively over her pregnant belly. Then a sudden commotion erupted outside the front door. Motorcycles roared into the driveway. Voices shouted in the darkness. The committee members rushed to the porch, their hands dropping to their holstered weapons. A group of scouts had returned, and they were carrying a frail, emaciated figure wrapped in blankets. It was Mother Abigail. She had been found wandering in the brush, starved and severely dehydrated, her clothing torn by thorns. She was barely conscious, her breathing a shallow, ragged rasp. The committee members surged forward, their faces etched with shock and relief, crowding around the old woman to carry her inside. On the ridge of Flagstaff Mountain, Harold Lauder stared down at the illuminated windows of the house. He raised the walkie-talkie to his lips, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. He spoke his name, claiming ownership of the destruction he was about to unleash, and pressed the button. Inside the house, Nick Andros stood in the living room. The commotion outside had drawn the others away, but Nick remained behind, a sudden, blinding realization piercing his mind. He moved toward the hallway closet, throwing open the door and tearing through the coats. He saw the shoebox. He saw the wires. He turned toward the doorway, waving his hands frantically, urging the others to run. The electrical signal reached the receiver. The blasting caps fired. The explosion tore the night apart. A blossom of orange fire erupted from the center of the house, expanding outward with terrifying force. The roof lifted off the support beams, shattering into thousands of burning splinters. The concussive shockwave rolled across the lawn, knocking Stu, Larry, and the others off their feet. Franny was thrown violently through the air, landing in a tangle of brush near a dry creek bed. The sound of the blast echoed off the flat irons, a deafening roar that shook the windows of homes miles away. A massive plume of black smoke spiraled into the starlit sky, illuminated by the crackling flames that consumed the wreckage of the house. In the immediate aftermath, there was only the ringing silence of shock, followed by the frantic screams of the survivors. Stu staggered to his feet, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, shouting Franny's name. He found her in the brush, dazed but miraculously alive, clutching her stomach. Larry Underwood pulled himself from the debris, staring in horror at the burning crater where the living room had been. The blast claimed the lives of several key figures. Susan Stern, who had lingered near the doorway, was killed by flying shrapnel. Chad Norris, the head of the burial detail, died in the yard, and Nick Andros, the silent heart of the committee, was caught directly in the epicenter of the explosion. He died in a flash of heat and light, leaving behind nothing but scattered pages of his handwritten notes. There's a cruel precision to how this is staged. Nick is the one who finds the bomb with seconds to spare, and Nick is the one person in that house who cannot shout a warning. His whole method of reaching people his whole life has been visual: a raised hand, a note, a look. None of it works fast enough against a countdown. The character defined throughout the book by finding ways around not being heard is killed by the one moment where being heard instantly was the only thing that could have saved anyone. But in King's multiverse, physical death does not sever a soul's connection to the pattern. Nick's corporeal body was destroyed, but his spirit transitioned fully into the service of the White, where he would eventually manifest as a ghost to guide Tom Cullen across the perilous winter wasteland. The cosmic war transcended the physical plane, and Nick Andros had simply moved to a higher level of the tower to continue his stand. The free zone was thrown into chaos. Medical teams rushed to the scene, treating the wounded and attempting to douse the flames. In the midst of the carnage, Mother Abigail was carried to a secure medical facility, her ancient body failing rapidly. The doctors tried to stabilize her, inserting intravenous lines and monitoring her fading pulse, but they knew her time was measured in hours. The surviving committee members gathered around her bed in the quiet hours before dawn. The smell of smoke and dust clung to their clothes. They were bruised, battered, and grieving the loss of their friends. Mother Abigail opened her eyes. The milky haze of cataracts seemed to vanish, replaced by a piercing, lucid clarity. She looked at the four men standing before her: Stu Redman, Larry Underwood, Ralph Brentner, and Glenn Bateman. She did not offer them comfort. She delivered a command. "God didn't bring you folks together to make a committee," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the medical equipment. "He brought you here only to send you further. You are to go west. You are to take no food, no water. You are to go this very day and in the clothes you stand up in. You are to go on foot," Franny protested, her voice cracking with despair, begging Stu not to embark on a suicidal mission. But Mother Abigail silenced her. "I am in the way of knowing that one of you will not reach your destination," the old woman continued, tears tracking through the deep wrinkles of her cheeks. "But he is in Las Vegas, and you must go there, and it is there that you will make your stand." With her final message delivered, Mother Abigail closed her eyes. She drew one last, shuddering breath and passed away. The shape of it owes more to Moses than to a typical king death scene. A prophet who leads her people to the edge of the promised land, delivers the law, and is denied the destination herself. The anchor of the Boulder Free Zone was gone, leaving the survivors to face the encroaching darkness alone. The four men stood in the quiet hospital room, the weight of the old woman's command pressing down on their shoulders. They had spent months trying to build a sanctuary, trying to rely on logic and democracy to save them from the ruins. Now they were asked to abandon all reason, to strip away their defenses, and to walk directly into the stronghold of a supernatural tyrant. As they packed their meager belongings and prepared to turn their backs on the safety of Boulder, they knew they were walking into a crucible, and across the desert, amidst the neon lights of Las Vegas, the dark man felt them coming, preparing a welcome that would test the very limits of their souls. Chapter 4. The Stand in Las Vegas. The morning sun cast long, pale shadows across the streets of Boulder as the four men prepared to leave. Stu Redman, Larry Underwood, Ralph Brentner, and Glenn Bateman stood at the edge of town, facing the foothills. They carried no backpacks, no canteens, and no weapons. They wore only the clothes on their backs and sturdy hiking boots. Mother Abigail had given them specific instructions before she died. They were to walk west, empty-handed, trusting in a higher power to provide for them. They were stepping entirely onto the path of the beam. By stripping themselves of weapons and supplies, they were surrendering their free will to Kai, acting as literal instruments of the white, whose only purpose was to serve as a pure, moral counterweight to the gathering darkness in the west. Franny Goldsmith stood on the curb, her face pale, fighting back tears as she hugged Stu one last time. Lucy Swan held Larry tight, her shoulders shaking. The men turned their backs on the safety of the free zone and began to walk. Beside them trotted Glenn's dog, Kojak, his tail wagging as if they were just going out for a morning stroll. The first few days on the highway tested their endurance. Without supplies, they relied on whatever they could scavenge from the stalled cars littering the interstate. They found stale crackers, forgotten candy bars, and half-empty bottles of soda baking in the glove compartments. The sun beat down on the asphalt, baking the air and making the horizon shimmer with heat mirages. Blisters formed on their heels. Their muscles ached, yet they kept a steady pace. They climbed through the high mountain passes, navigating around the rusted remains of tractor trailers and the quiet, decaying bodies of those who had tried to flee the pandemic months ago. As they crossed the state line into Utah, the landscape changed. The lush green pines of Colorado gave way to flat, arid scrubland and towering rock formations that looked like the bones of ancient beasts. The silence here felt different. It was an observant silence, a feeling that unseen eyes were tracking their progress from the shadows of the canyons. The nights grew colder. They huddled together for warmth, building small fires from dried sagebrush and listening to the wind howl through the rocks. Their progress came to a sudden, devastating halt near the San Rafael River. A flash flood had washed out a large section of the interstate, leaving a steep, crumbling ravine 50 feet deep. They had no rope. The only way forward was to climb down the treacherous slope and scale the other side. Stu went first, picking his way carefully down the loose dirt. Glenn followed, his joints stiff with arthritis, but he managed to reach the bottom. Larry made the descent without trouble. Ralph came last, finding his footing among the shifting stones. Climbing the opposite bank proved much harder. The dirt was dry and prone to sliding. Ralph reached the top, pulling himself over the edge of the asphalt. Stu climbed next. He was inches from the top, his hand reaching for a piece of exposed pavement, when the rock beneath his left foot broke loose. Stu slid. He grabbed for a handhold, but his fingers only dug into the loose, powdery dirt. He tumbled backward, tumbling end over end down the steep incline. His body slammed into a jagged boulder sticking out from the side of the ravine. He heard a sharp, snapping sound, loud as a gunshot in the quiet air. Pain flared through his right leg, burning hot and bright. He slid the rest of the way to the bottom, coming to a stop in the dirt, clutching his knee and gasping for air. Larry scrambled down the slope and knelt beside him. Stu's face had gone pale and sweaty. His leg rested at an unnatural angle. The bone was broken in at least 2 places, and the knee was badly damaged. Glenn opened a small plastic bottle of pills he carried for his arthritis and handed one to Stu. The medication dulled the sharp edges of the pain, but the reality of their situation hung over them like a dark cloud. They were miles from anywhere without medical supplies, food, or a way to transport a wounded man. "You have to go on," Stu told them, his voice tight. Larry shook his head, his eyes wide. "We are not leaving you here. We can find a car, maybe a wagon, something." "No cars," Stu replied. "Mother Abigail said we walk. You know the rules. If you stay here trying to figure out how to drag me, we all die. The winter is coming. You have to leave me." The argument lasted for an hour, but Stu refused to yield. He commanded Larry to take charge of the group and lead them west. It was the hardest decision Larry had ever made. He felt a sickening wave of guilt as he realized he had to walk away from his friend. Ralph wiped tears from his weathered cheeks. Glenn patted Stu on the shoulder, handing over the rest of the pain pills. "Pull the plug if you have to, East Texas," Glenn told him softly, looking at the bottle. "Don't suffer." "I'll be okay," Stu lied. The three men climbed out of the ravine. Larry looked back one last time, seeing Stu sitting in the dirt, leaning against a rock. Then, they turned their faces toward Nevada and continued their march, leaving Stu alone in the vast, echoing emptiness of the Utah Badlands. "It's the Stovington escape again, in miniature, and it feels deliberate." Stu ends the first quarter of the book alone in a landscape with nothing, and he ends the third quarter the same way, except this time by choice, ordering the others to leave him rather than slow them down. The freedom that felt like loss in Vermont has, by this point, curdled into something closer to sacrifice. Same image, opposite meaning. While the four men made their slow trek, Harold Lauder and Nadine Cross were speeding westward on motorcycles, fleeing the wreckage they had caused in Boulder. Harold felt a twisted sense of triumph. He had detonated the explosive, striking a blow against the people who had overlooked him. But as they rode deeper into the mountains, the thrill faded, replaced by a gnawing, cold anxiety. He noticed a change in Nadine. Her hair had turned snow-white. Her eyes held a blank, terrifying stare. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice sounded hollow, like a recording played in an empty room. They were navigating a sharp, winding curve on the western slope of Colorado when Flag, sensing their fading usefulness, caused Harold's motorcycle to skid out from under him. The front wheel washed out. The bike slammed into the metal guardrail, launching Harold over the edge. He fell down the steep embankment, bouncing off rocks and tearing through thorny brush. He landed hard against the trunk of a fallen tree, his right leg shattering upon impact. The pain blinded him for a moment. When Harold opened his eyes, he looked up at the road. Nadine was standing by the guardrail, staring down at him. Her face showed no emotion. "Nadine!" Harold yelled, his voice cracking. "Get the rope, it's in the saddlebag, pull me up." Nadine shook her head slowly. "All of this was arranged, Harold," she called down to him, her tone eerily calm. "I have to go on. I'm sorry." Enraged, Harold drew his pistol and fired at her, but his shaking hands sent the shot wide. Harold watched in disbelief as the woman he thought was his partner in revenge turned away and mounted her scooter. The sound of her engine faded into the distance, leaving him alone with the buzzing flies and the baking sun. Compare this Nadine to the one a few chapters back, agonizing over which parts of herself she could still bear to give up. That woman is gone. What's left doesn't read as triumphant or even cruel. It's closer to watching someone sleepwalk. King spends the whole Harold and Nadine plot building a person capable of complicated, self-aware guilt, then has Flag hollow her out completely in the exact stretch of story where his use for her is also about to run out. For days, Harold dragged himself inches at a time up the rocky slope, fueled by a stubborn will to survive. He managed to reach his wrecked motorcycle, finding a few cans of food and a pen. Sitting in the dirt, his legs swollen and infected, he opened his journal. The fever burned in his brain. He realized, too late, the true nature of the force he had chosen to serve. The dark man had used him, manipulated his insecurities, and discarded him the moment his usefulness ended. Harold wrote his final entry, a rambling apology and an acknowledgement of his own choices. He signed it not with his given name, but with the nickname the burial crew had given him back in Boulder, Hawk. Then, Harold placed the barrel of a revolver in his mouth and pulled the trigger, ending his tragic, misguided journey. It's worth noting what Harold does with his last hour. He writes, "He's narrated his own grievances to an audience of one for the entire book, and dying alone with an infected leg doesn't change that habit. It just removes the audience." Signing off as Hawk, the nickname Boulder gave him back when people still liked him, reads less like irony and more like Harold finally choosing which version of himself he once left behind. Nadine rode alone into the desert. When her scooter broke down, she walked. The sun blistered her skin, turning it a painful, peeling red. Her mind fragmented, slipping between lucid terror and a strange, floating apathy. She wandered into the barren wastes, waiting for him to arrive. Randall Flagg found her under the cold light of a full moon. He appeared sitting on the hood of an abandoned car, grinning a smile that held no warmth. He took her hand, his touch burning like a furnace, and led her into the dark scrub brush. What followed was a horrific, mind-shattering union. Flagg's true face revealed itself in the shadows, a demonic, shifting visage with glowing yellow eyes and sharp, predatory teeth. Nadine screamed as the cold, dead magic of the dark man invaded her body. The experience broke the last fragile threads of her sanity. Flagg brought her to Las Vegas, presenting her to his followers as his bride. She was a silent, catatonic shell, staring blankly at the walls of the penthouse suite in the MGM Grand. But the dark man's empire was not as secure as it appeared. The psychic shield that had protected Tom Cullen from Flagg's vision still held, and the mysterious disappearance of the third spy gnawed at Flagg's confidence. His temper flared unpredictably. He threw fits of rage, shattering glass and hurling furniture across his office. His followers noticed the change. The flawless, terrifying composure of the walk-in dude was beginning to crack. When Nadine, in a brief moment of horrifying clarity, taunted Flagg about his failing control, he snapped. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his rage boiling over. Knowing she carried his unborn heir, Nadine goaded him, understanding that provoking him was her only way out. Blind with fury, Flagg hurled her through the shattered window of the penthouse. Nadine fell to the pavement far below, dying on impact. Flagg stared down at her broken body, howling into the desert wind, realizing he had just destroyed his own dark legacy. Set this next to Dana Jurgen's death a few scenes earlier and a pattern emerges. Two women, both effectively owned by men in this story, both die by forcing the hand of whoever is trying to control them rather than waiting to be controlled. Dana goes through the glass rather than give up Tom's name. Nadine needles Flagg into killing her rather than remain his. Neither death reads as defeat on the page. Both read as the only form of agency either woman has left, and both of them take it. His attempt to breed a physical heir was a profound act of cosmic hubris. Entities of the outer dark, like Flagg, are ultimately sterile forces of chaos. By trying to anchor his legacy in the physical world through Nadine, he had only accelerated the unraveling of his own demonic magic. Meanwhile, Larry, Ralph, and Glenn walked deeper into Utah. They were exhausted, hungry, and grieving for Stu. They marched down the center of the empty highway, bracing themselves for the inevitable encounter. It happened just east of the Nevada border. Two Utah State Patrol cars blocked the road, parked nose to nose. A group of armed men waited behind the vehicles. The leader of the guards, a former police detective named Barry Dorgan, stepped forward, aiming a revolver at the three exhausted travelers. Larry did not run. He raised his hands, a strange sense of peace settling over him. They had arrived. The guards bound their wrists with handcuffs and shoved them into the back of a transport van. The ride to Las Vegas took hours. When they arrived at the local county jail, the guards separated them, placing them in different cell blocks. Larry sat on a moldy mattress in a dark cell, listening to the drip of a leaky pipe. He thought of Lucy, and he thought of Stu, hoping his friend had found some peace in the desert. Down the hall, Glenn Bateman sat cross-legged on the floor of his cell. He found a piece of charcoal and amused himself by writing philosophical quotes on the concrete walls. He felt the temperature in the room drop. The heavy metal door at the end of the corridor slid open and footsteps echoed on the tiles. Randall Flagg stood outside the bars, accompanied by a pale, sweating Lloyd Henrade. Flagg wore a white silk shirt, grinning his signature, unsettling smile. "I have decided to let you go," Flagg told Glenn, his voice dripping with false benevolence. "All you have to do is get down on your knees and ask me." Glenn looked at the dark man. He noted the erratic twitch in Flagg's eye, the forced nature of his grin. The sociologist saw through the supernatural facade, recognizing the insecure, terrified tyrant hiding underneath. Glenn Bateman threw his head back and laughed. It was a deep, belly-shaking laugh that echoed down the prison corridors. He pointed at Flagg, tears of mirth streaming down his face. "You are nothing," Glenn chuckled, wiping his eyes. "I am laughing at our own foolishness. We were so frightened of you." The smile vanished from Flagg's face. The air in the cell block crackled with ozone. Flagg grabbed the metal bars, his knuckles turning white. "Stop laughing," he commanded, his voice vibrating with rage. Glenn only laughed harder, rocking back and forth on the floor. "Shoot him, Lloyd," Flagg roared, his face twisting into a demonic scowl. Lloyd pulled a pistol from his waistband. His hands shook. He aimed the gun at the old man sitting on the floor. Glenn looked at Lloyd, still smiling, showing no fear. "It is all right, Mr. Henrade," Glenn said softly. "You do not know any better." "Shut up," Lloyd screamed, tears streaming down his face. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot deafened the narrow hallway. Glenn Bateman fell backward, his laughter silenced forever. Lloyd dropped the gun, backing away from the cell, horrified by his own actions. That horror isn't really remorse for Glenn. In the novel, the shooting is intercut with flashes of Lloyd's own worst memories. The cellmate he nearly ate, the partner he watched die. He's a starved, degraded man, taking his history out on the one voice that ever named what he'd become, which is sadder and harder to watch than simple obedience to Flagg. Flagg stared at the body, his chest heaving, his magic failing to inspire the fear he so desperately craved. The execution brought him no satisfaction. It only highlighted his slipping control. Glenn had unwittingly weaponized the most powerful defense against the entities of the macroverse: ridicule. By laughing, Glenn exposed the ultimate truth that evil, stripped of its terrifying illusions, is fundamentally pathetic and hollow. The sociologist's laughter permanently fractured the psychic grip Flagg held over his followers. The following morning, the sun beat down on the sprawling lawn in front of the MGM Grand. Flagg ordered his followers to assemble for a public execution. Hundreds of people gathered, standing in the heat, their faces pale and drawn. 2 flatbed trucks sat parked near the decorative fountains. On the back of each truck sat a welded steel cage. Larry Underwood and Ralph Brentner were marched out of the hotel lobby and locked inside the cages. Their shirts had been stripped away. Heavy steel chains were attached to their handcuffs, the other ends bolted to the towing hitches of the 2 flatbed trucks. The plan was gruesome and clear. The trucks would drive in opposite directions, tearing the men apart in front of the crowd. Flagg stood between the cages holding a rolled piece of parchment. He read a list of charges branding Larry and Ralph as spies and murderers, blaming them for the recent sabotage at the airbase. Larry gripped the bars of his cage, looking out at the silent, terrified faces of the crowd. He realized these people were not evil. They were simply paralyzed by fear. "You people know this is wrong," Larry shouted, his voice echoing across the courtyard. "Remember the way we die. Next time it might be your turn." A ripple of uneasy murmurs passed through the crowd. Suddenly, a man pushed his way to the front. It was Whitney Horgan, one of the head cooks. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes wide with desperate courage. "This ain't right," Whitney yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Flagg. "This ain't how Americans act." The crowd gasped. Flagg turned his dark, burning eyes toward the cook. "Come here, Whitney," Flagg whispered, his voice slicing through the murmur. Whitney froze, but his feet began to shuffle forward against his will, drawn by the dark man's magic. "You ain't a man at all," Whitney choked out, tears spilling down his cheeks. "You are some kind of devil." Flagg raised his left hand, extending his index finger. A ball of crackling blue fire formed at the tip. It grew to the size of a baseball, spitting arcs of electricity. Flagg flicked his wrist. The ball of fire shot forward, landing on Whitney's chin. It crossed his mouth, fusing his lips shut, then his cheek, his eyes, and his forehead, burning off his hair as it went. Whitney swayed on his feet and then fell, mercifully face down. Whitney Horgan gets maybe 30 seconds of the story, and he's not chosen for anything, not a committee member, not touched by anyone's visions, just a cook who decides, in the one moment it counts, not to stay quiet. It's a quieter rehearsal for what the trashcan man does by accident a few minutes later. Flagg's regime doesn't fall to a hero. It falls because ordinary people stop cooperating with their own fear. "Is there anyone else here who disagrees?" Flagg roared, his voice booming like thunder. Before anyone could answer, a strange, whining hum drifted over the crowd. People turned their heads, looking toward the street. The crowd parted, backing away in horror. Driving a stolen, battery-powered ATV across the pavement was the trashcan man. He was a walking nightmare. The radiation sickness from his scavenger hunts in the deep desert had ravaged his body. His hair was gone. His teeth had fallen out. His skin was covered in weeping sores and blistering burns. He steered the cart with twisted, claw-like hands. A mad, ecstatic grin plastered across his decaying face. Resting in the trailer hitched behind the ATV, secured with ropes, was a sleek, silver cylinder. Stamped on the side were military serial numbers. It was a nuclear warhead, dragged from a forgotten testing facility in the wasteland. "I brought it," Trashcan Man croaked, his voice bubbling with fluid. "I brought you the fire. My life for you." Flagg stared at the warhead, genuine terror flooding his face for the first time. The dark man raised his hands, trying to summon his magic to stop the cart, to extinguish the spark of madness he had nurtured in the arsonist's mind. But his power wavered. The control he relied upon evaporated. "Take it away!" Flagg shrieked, his composure shattering. Up in his cage, Ralph Brentner looked toward the sky. He pointed a scarred finger toward the clouds. "Larry!" Ralph cried out, his voice filled with overwhelming awe. "The hand of God." Larry looked up. The blue ball of fire that Flagg had conjured to punish Whitney Horgan was drifting upward. It hung in the air above the courtyard, shifting and changing shape. As Larry watched, the crackling electricity formed the unmistakable outline of a giant, glowing hand. The spectral hand drifted downward, ignoring Flagg's frantic screams. It moved toward the ATV, drawn to the silver cylinder resting in the back. This was the ultimate intervention of Gan, the creator and cosmic spirit of the White. But the White did not strike with a sword. It simply hijacked Flagg's own malevolent power, the very blue lightning he had conjured in anger to oppress his people, and turned it against the nuclear payload brought by the Trashcan Man. It was a cosmic irony proving that evil, driven by its own chaotic nature, will eventually consume itself. This is also the single most argued over moment in the whole novel, and it's worth being upfront about that. Readers and critics have debated for decades whether ending well over 1,000 pages of build-up with literal divine intervention, rather than anything the human characters do, is a satisfying resolution or a cop-out. A textbook deus ex machina, God from the machine, arriving to solve what the heroes couldn't. The counter-argument is that it's not a bug, a story that spent the whole book insisting individual willpower isn't enough against Flag would be cheating itself if it let individual willpower win in the end. Both readings hold up. It's worth letting your audience sit with both instead of picking one for them. Flag tried to run, but his feet remained rooted to the pavement. His clothes seemed to collapse inward, his form losing its shape as the magic unraveled. With a final, echoing wail of denial, Randall Flagg vanished, leaving only a pile of empty clothes on the grass. The glowing blue hand reached the warhead. The electricity arced across the metal casing, seeking the firing mechanism. Larry Underwood closed his eyes. He thought of the friends he had lost. He thought of Lucy. A profound sense of peace washed over him. He gripped the bars of his cage and smiled. "I will fear no evil," he whispered. Trace that back to the park bench in Central Park. Larry started this story admitting he'd always been a taker, someone who ran when things got hard. The man in the cage, calm and already at peace on his way to a nuclear blast, is that same man's verdict on himself, rewritten. King never announces the change. He just lets you notice the coward from the tunnel is the one steady voice the crowd needed. The white light consumed the world. The flash blinded the desert, followed by a shockwave that flattened the casinos, melted the sand into glass, and erased the dark man's empire from the face of the earth in a heartbeat. In the bottom of a dry wash in Utah, Stu Redman lay shivering in his sleeping bag. The fever from his pneumonia raged, causing him to drift in and out of consciousness. He heard the scrabble of paws on the dirt. Kojak, the Irish setter, trotted down the embankment, dropping a dead rabbit at Stu's feet. The dog barked, a sound of loyal encouragement. A few hours later, a new sound echoed in the canyon. It was the crunch of boots on gravel. A large man with blonde hair and a bright, innocent smile climbed down into the wash. It was Tom Cullen. Following the post-hypnotic instructions planted by Nick Andros, Tom had hidden during the day and traveled by the light of the moon, escaping Las Vegas before the dark man could find him. Tom knelt beside Stu, unpacking a stolen first aid kit filled with antibiotics, scavenged from an abandoned pharmacy. Tom fed Stu the pills, crushing them into water. He built a fire, cooked the rabbit, and stayed by the sick man's side. Days turned into weeks. Under Tom's dedicated care, and fueled by his own stubborn will to live, Stu's fever broke. His shattered leg began to knit together. It's worth pausing on who's doing the saving here. Tom is the character the book, and for a while, every other character treats as the one who needs looking after. Nick becomes his protector, and the committee nearly rules him out as a spy candidate on the assumption he can't handle it. And yet it's Tom, alone, on a stolen bicycle in the dead of winter, who keeps the story's most physically capable man alive. King doesn't make a speech out of the irony. He just quietly hands the competence to the one person everyone else had already written off. When Stu was strong enough to move, Tom found an old, rusted Plymouth sedan sitting on the highway. Miraculously, the keys were still in the ignition. They managed to push-start the vehicle, nursing the engine along the snowy mountain roads until they reached a town where they swapped the car for a sturdy snowmobile. They spent the harsh winter holed up in a Holiday Inn in Grand Junction, Colorado, surviving on scavenged canned goods and keeping warm by a gas generator. When the snows finally began to melt in early spring, they packed the snowmobile and drove the final stretch back to Boulder. The return of Stu Redman was hailed as a miracle by the Free Zone. Franny Goldsmith wept as she held him, introducing him to her newborn son, Peter. But the birth of the child brought a new wave of anxiety. A few days after Peter was born, he developed a cough. He caught the superflu, but his tiny neck miraculously never showed the dark, bruising discolorations that marked the terminal stage of Captain Trips. The doctors in Boulder watched helplessly as the baby fought the virus. For a tense week, the community held its breath. Then, the symptoms faded. The baby's immune system, inherited in part from his mother, fought off the shifting-antigen flu. Peter recovered, proving that humanity could reproduce and survive in the new world. The name isn't incidental. Franny's own father, who dies of the superflu early in the story, was also named Peter Goldsmith. Naming her son after him reads as her quiet answer to everything the book has taken from her: continuity instead of extinction. The free zone thrived, but the memory of the dark man lingered. Stu and Franny decided to leave Boulder, seeking a quieter life on the coast of Maine, far away from the politics and growing bureaucracy of the expanding society. They packed their belongings, ready to start a new chapter, hoping the lessons of the past would not be forgotten. Far away, on a beach of white sand bordered by a lush green jungle, a man woke up. He wore faded jeans and run-down cowboy boots. He sat up, rubbing his head, his memory a fragmented haze. He looked down the beach and saw a group of primitive brown-skinned men emerging from the trees, carrying spears. The dark man stood up. He did not know his name, or how he had arrived on this shore. But as the warriors approached, he flashed a wide, charismatic grin. "My name is Russell Faraday," he told them, his eyes dancing with dark amusement, and the frightened warriors sank to their knees before their new god. This moment perfectly encapsulates the tragic, cyclical nature of the multiverse. It also quietly pays off Glenn Bateman's own skepticism from earlier in the book, where he predicts society will rebuild, but doubts it will really reform. The ending doesn't just bring Flag back, it vindicates the one character who bet against real change from the start. Flag is a dark constant, bound to the endlessly turning wheel of Kai. He may be temporarily defeated, his empire wiped from one level of the Dark Tower, but his essence merely slips through the cracks between worlds to start the process over again, forever building sandcastles of tyranny destined to be washed away. Every screen version has kept this beat, because King keeps writing it that way. The 1994 miniseries with Gary Sinise and Jamie Sheridan, and the 2020 series with James Marsden and Alexander Skarsgård, both end on Flag's rebirth as Russell Faraday. The 2020 finale goes further. King wrote new material giving Franny a direct confrontation with Flag the novel never gives her, something he said for years he regretted leaving out. It's a strange gap once you notice it. Franny is one of the book's most developed interior voices for 700 pages, and then the climax physically writes her out of it because she's 8 months pregnant and stays behind. Giving her a real scene against Flag 4 decades later isn't fan service. It's King correcting a structural choice his own ending never resolved. The terrifying cycle of manipulation and control is a recurring theme in King's universe. To uncover how another charismatic villain bends the vulnerable to his dark will, click the video on your screen to explore Stephen King's lore, Sunlight, Gardner, and the anatomy of a cult leader, The Talisman.